Isaac, welcome to the Tales of Leadership podcast, brother. How you doing?
Good, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, public apologies. Sorry it's taken me so long to get you on the show. So I know you reached out, and me being a full-time Army officer, mission always comes first. This is something I'm passionate about, but I'm glad to actually get you on the show and do it during a normal time, so you don't have to film at like 7 o'clock at night. So
Yeah,
it's
of
it's great.
course. No problem.
So I always like starting off with a couple preloaded questions because it just sets a barometer for the podcast and really tell me a lot about like who you are. And the first one's always the same because I think it's important because I'm trying to distill the facts of all the leadership wisdom that the guests have on. And you, coming from a combat arms background as an aviator in the Marine Corps over 7 combat deployments, I'm very curious. How do you define leadership in your terms?
To me, leadership is really just putting people that you're responsible for in a position to be successful, and try to keep it
Mm,
that simple, and really make that the focus, and constantly remind yourself as a leader that that's really at the end of the day the job, right? If I'm effective, I'm putting them in a position to be successful. I can't necessarily do it for them from that point forward, but it's my responsibility to give them the opportunity and set the conditions. And so that's really the way I approached it the entire time I was in the military, and after transitioning in the business world as well.
yeah, no, I think that's a beautiful way of defining it is that leadership really, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what I do. It's the legacy that I leave and the impact, and that's really through the people. And if we empower our people to make a difference, that's how we actually grow as individuals and organizations.
Absolutely.
So kind of jump into starting off in your leadership journey. So I know sports was a big part of your upbringing growing up in Texas, and now
Yep.
you're like in California, right? But
Yeah, I
I think
am.
starting there, where did your leadership journey start?
That really is where it started. And the interesting thing is, hindsight's 2020, but I didn't totally realize how much I'd learned, frankly, as a child until much later in life. So I was fortunate to grow up in a house where my dad was a high school football and a baseball coach. My mom was a teacher. So I literally spent all of my time on the dusty ball fields of West Texas and hanging out at the high school, watching my dad basically do his job. So I was just immersed in watching mainly him, lead these groups of young people all the time. And I didn't realize what I was learning or seeing or observing until much later. As a fairly young officer in the Marine Corps, I finally, like, the light bulb went on one day, and I was like, oh, I understand this. This is the same thing I was looking at, when I was not even 10 years old back in Lubbock, Texas. And once I made that connection, I realized that really was the foundation. And I also realized it really gave me, I would call it a head start as an
Yeah.
officer in the Marine Corps, because I already understood quite a bit of things that I was going to need to understand to be successful there too.
With that too, like just thinking back, so that's awesome that you had like a mentor in your father, because I think at a young age, especially men too, because we all have a little bit of crazy in us, especially those
Of
who choose
course.
to join the military. Having a role model that models the kind of behaviors that need to be implemented or in the world. What were some of like the characteristics or values that your dad had that kind of set you apart?
I would say the number one thing that he always emphasized to me with a star next to it was what he called mental toughness.
Mm,
He was like, you need to be physically tough, you've got to work hard, you've got to be a great teammate. But to him, the differentiator was always mental toughness, right? How do you respond under pressure? How do you bounce back in adverse conditions or situations? How do you deal with failure? And we spent a lot of time talking about that specifically. And I think that was extremely beneficial to me later as a combat aviator, to have, been talking about these things and learning about them since I was a kid was extremely beneficial. And I give him a lot of credit for understanding that and focusing on it.
yeah, and I think that's a great place to kind of dig into is that I've had to understand this and build upon it like throughout my career is that failure is not final. It's not fatal in a way. Is that it, and when I went and got my master's degree in systems engineering, it really helped me like think through failure is, hey, in engineering, they don't call it failure. They call it iterative development. They understand
Yeah.
something fails and then they fix that thing and then they release a new product or a new service and they continue to iterate and make it better. And I didn't have that early on in my career, but how did your dad, like when you were really young, how did he help instill that to where it's just stuck with you?
He was just very opportunistic situationally.
I
So
love it.
sometimes it was something that I had done or experienced in a little league game, and sometimes it was, me helping him break down film and him stopping and saying, "Hey,
Mm,
I called the wrong defense right here. This is what happened. I should have seen this, and so next time I'll be sure when I see, that motion that I'm going to do X, Y, Z to counter it." So he was always just very open and honest about pointing out mistakes and then talking through how do we learn from them so we can be better next time.
yeah, and I know sports very important to your upbringing, but also to like going through your book, you use mastering the fundamentals, right?
Yep.
What does that mean to you? Like mastering the basics or the fundamentals?
Well, to me, it really goes back to this philosophy, and I will die on this hill that in a leadership position, especially, one of the pieces of art to it is taking something complicated and making it
Mm.
simple enough for the team to execute.
Oh, I love
So,
that.
so I'm always looking at everything from an angle of how do I distill this down to totally just what is the main thing? Because if we can get the main thing right, all the details have a funny way of working themselves out. So by doing that, it just simplifies the problem for everybody. We used to do the same thing when I was an instructor at the weapons and tactics school, and we would
Yeah.
literally tell the students, the art in these tactics is taking something very complicated and making it simple enough for your squadron back home to go execute in combat. Because
Mm.
your dash 4 dash 5 air crew is not going to be rock stars most likely, and they have to
Yeah.
be able to execute your plan too. And just maintaining that basic philosophy throughout has been extremely helpful to me, and it's really carried over into the business world. As a chief operating officer of a company, I do the same thing every day for 500 people. How do we make this simple enough for them to go execute well? And that's my really, it annoys my peers in the company, I'm sure, as we're sitting in the conference room, but I'm always the one that's like too complicated, too many words, they're not going to be able to do it, we got to make it
Yeah.
simple. But distilling it down like that really helps, I think.
Yeah, it being so I resonate deeply with that. Being an infantry guy, is I my model in life is KISS, keep it simple,
Oh
stupid.
yeah,
Yeah, that's
that's a
been
great one.
my go-to, and if I can keep that, regardless of like communicating to civilians now in the acquisition corps, or when I was doing mission planning for ground maneuver and talking to privates, I how can I communicate clearly enough to you that you can take what I've given you and then go operate within the left and right limits and be successful to get to that end state and hit the key tasks. And if I can do
Absolutely.
that, I crushed it, knocked it out of the
Yeah,
park.
absolutely. And it can be really challenging to do that, I think, especially the more senior you get in whatever
Yeah,
organization you're in, because I think most human beings, their natural tendency is they want to display how intelligent they are, what a great
yeah,
idea they have, but they're not thinking about how that ripples down and out through the organization to whoever's
yeah,
going to have to actually execute the thing. And that's something I think you have to learn through some observation. And the military is a great training ground for that, right? Because if you make that mistake, then it's going to go sideways and it's going to blow
yeah.
back on you. So you kind of learn the hard way sometimes, like, hey, we've got to keep this simple enough to go actually do it.
Yeah, that reminds me of like a quick story. When I was going through the Naval Postgraduate School, that was really my first introduction into the like the sister services of the Marine Corps and the Navy. And I had to do while I was getting my ILE accreditation for major, I had to go do naval planning. So you got this army dude, and I'm trying to figure out how to like maneuver. I do a Harry Potter. I'm like, we're magically on the beach. Here is my ground maneuver plan. It's super awesome. Let's talk about that. And then the instructor is like, hey, don't baffle me with your BS. And that just stuck with me at that moment of like sometimes like all the words, things, like doesn't really matter. Like, what are the key facts? Let's just get after it, keep it as simple as possible.
Yeah, that's great.
So transitioning, from your young childhood, growing up in sports, having your role model being a father, your father being like a chief role model, what drove you to want to serve and use the leadership?
Well, to be honest, it really that tied back to sports too. So I stopped playing sports when I graduated from high school because I was a good student. I knew I wasn't quite a good enough athlete to ever say get paid for it, right? Maybe I'd end up
Yeah.
being a coach or something if I pursued college athletics, but I certainly wasn't going to go pro, and I knew that. And I also just had this kind of desire. It was really difficult for me to explain at the time to go have some kind of an adventure, go experience something interesting in life. And so I was going to college, honestly, just because I thought I was supposed to, not because I really
Yeah.
wanted enjoying it. But I was seeking a path. And the more I thought about it, the more I decided, or the more I just came to the conclusion of the military would be a very good fit for me. And I might find the part of sports that I was missing, which is really the teammates, the camaraderie, the
Mm,
contributing to something bigger than yourself. And so I slowly came to the conclusion that it might be a good fit. And then trying the aviation route was really kind of a whim and just thinking, frankly, no more than that sounds cool. Go fly
yeah.
around in some aircraft and blow some stuff up and see what happens. And so I started to pursue it from there, almost on a whim. I decided one night, literally over a conversation with my father, who at the time looked at me like I was insane and just got up and walked back into the house, which
Yeah.
we still laugh about to this day. But in that moment, I was like, you know what? I'm doing this. Like, I just decided I was doing it and then started to pursue it. And thankfully ended up being a great fit. I would definitely do it all over again in a heartbeat.
Yeah, no, like reading through your book, it's funny how many similarities like we share. And I think everyone who serves and goes on a combat deployments and has a family, they share the same stories roughly. But that God bless you, right, for joining the Marine Corps and then doing all those deployments. How many Marines and soldiers' lives did you save because of what you've done? So you definitely chose the right path, and I thank you for everything you've done. We'll get into those stories, but it's
Yeah, of
pretty
course.
incredible what you did.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so kind of continuing on that theme, you decide to make that transition to go be an officer, go Quantico, Virginia, which is
Yeah.
like 20 minutes down the road from where I'm at right now at Fort Belvoir. What was that like? Now being a very rigid organization that has very solid core values that are steeped in history, and then being put into that type of situation as a young man.
I really enjoyed it, to be honest with you. I mean, it was mildly terrifying. I was very out of my comfort zone, like everybody else. And,
Yeah,
you have these moments where you're like, oh man, am I way too far out over my skis by being here?
yeah,
But I settled in pretty quick. And even though it was a slightly more extreme version than what I was used to in terms of discipline and being regimented, it felt familiar and I was comfortable with that. It didn't
mm,
rattle me. And I really responded well to it. So very quickly, I came to the conclusion that I'm in the right place. This is the right place for me to be, and I
yeah.
think I can be successful here. And I was just a sponge. I mean, I consider myself to be a fairly observant person, and I was just
Yeah.
observing everything around me, trying to keep a low profile. Don't skyline yourself and get your stuff done. And that basic strategy for the most part worked. And then it's, like a snowball rolling downhill. You have a little success, you get a little more confident, a little more success, a little more confident. And just almost on a daily basis, I felt progressively more comfortable with it and progressively more convinced that I was doing what was the best thing for me and that I was going to enjoy it.
So that's one thing that I noticed as a theme throughout your career, starting off like really in the Marine Corps of like, hey, which students are doing well, right? And then
Yep.
gravitating towards them and then learning from them and then emulating those behaviors and characteristics. And then as you transition to into being an actual aviator in the Marine Corps unit, you did the exact same thing. You
Yep.
gravitated towards the people that had influence and you were a sponge, which I think that's a huge nugget that a lot of people don't really fully understand when they're going through their journey, or they decide they want to go be a Marine or a soldier or whatever have you. They think it's an individual journey, like, hey, it's all on me. It's not. You got to collectively understand, hey, you're new to the team. Humble yourself, learn as quickly as possible, and find those people with influence and authority, and then learn from them, because that's how you shorten the learning curve. So that was a huge theme that I've noticed in your journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did that throughout my entire career at every level, and I still do it to this day, on the backside of a military career. It's been very helpful for me. And I've I've done the most learning from literally observing and talking to others who did
Yeah.
it first and were successful.
Yeah. Another thing that struck me early on in your book is that you discussed majors, right? So field grade
Oh
officers.
yeah,
So I'm here right now. I've been promoted. I've been a major for a while.
nice.
Captain was my favorite because
Of
they gave
course.
me keys to a Humvee when I was at JRTC, and I could just drive around, do whatever I wanted. I may or may not have done some mudding in
Yeah.
the swamps of Louisiana. And then just being a company commander, and
Yeah.
deploying and being with troops has just been phenomenal. But I definitely agree with you. Something happens when you get that field grade
Yeah.
status that you get a lobotomy. So how did you start formulating that opinion? Because I loved it when you mentioned that in your book. I was just giggling like a little girl.
Yeah, well, it was really two things. And going back to being observant. So when I was a young captain in the squadron, there were four squadrons in our hangar, and the playing field's perfectly level, right? Everyone has the same number of aircraft, same number of Marines, same qualifications, same tools, same part supply. Everything's the same. But after a couple of deployment cycles, I noticed that at any given time, one squadron was awesome, two were, call it mediocre, and one was terrible.
Yeah.
And it didn't take me too long to realize that it was the scheduled leadership changes that were
Yeah.
the inflection points that were causing those squadrons to either get better or worse. And so I really started paying attention to the field grade officers in all of the squadrons, from the commanding officers, lieutenant colonel, through the handful of majors who are department heads, and
Mm,
just picking out like what's working and what's not working, and just literally observing that. And one of the biggest takeaways I had was that there were guys that I had observed that had been great captains and senior captains that were very successful and everyone, respected, and they'd done well. And then they pinned on major and just turned into a different human being.
yeah.
And my observation was that they stopped being themselves and they started just emulating behaviors they had previously observed from other majors, and not necessarily
Uh,
good ones.
yeah.
And so that really struck with me like, okay, if you stay around in the Marine Corps long enough to become one of those guys, don't do that. Like, just keep being you.
Yeah.
Like don't try to turn into something that you're not, or emulate somebody who's not the right person to emulate, or feel obligated to display these specific behaviors. Just keep being you. You're the same person, you just have a different rank. Just keep treating everyone the same, keep doing the same things, you'll probably be okay. And that was really my
Yes.
approach.
Just knowing your story through reading your book, I think you've done that, and kudos to you. And I think the cost that sometimes you have to share is that you rub people wrong the right
Oh,
sometimes,
for
like
sure.
commanders, but it's totally worth it, and you get the love and respect of everyone around your team. I remember being in acquisitions, and I'll just sit in my office listening to Viking death metal. I was like, "Hey, I'm not going to change who I am just because like I'm an acquisition officer now. I'm still Josh." So I deeply respect and value that you were authentic through your whole approach, and hopefully you're carrying that on in the civilian world now.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually was just having a conversation yesterday with someone who works for me, and he literally asked me, he goes, "Were you this way when you were in the Marine Corps, or were you like way more intense and yelling at everybody?" And I was like, "No, I was exactly the same. Same guy.
Yeah.
Like I've been the same this whole time." And he was kind of surprised by that. But it was an interesting conversation because his assumption, of course, was, "Oh, you must have been way more intense or crazy or whatever in the Marine Corps." And I was like, "Nah. I mean, I was intense in the aircraft." But
Yeah.
as far as interacting with people and leading and doing the same stuff I do now, no, same approach.
So kind of continuing through your journey, you finish. So one thing I've learned, and I'm assuming it's true in the Marine Corps, is like to be a pilot, it's like a 2-year pipeline.
Oh
You
yeah,
go do your basic in the Marine Corps. Everyone's a soldier first, which I absolutely love, or a Marine first. So you master the basic fundamentals. Then you go to your branch of choice, which is aviation. I think
yep,
that's like an additional 2 years. So the time you show up, you're a senior first lieutenant, captain,
yep.
which is awesome, but also too a little bit like nerve wracking, right? Like because you show up, you have 2 years of schoolhouse experience. How did you begin to build trust? And then like 9/11 happened, right?
Yeah.
And then you had to apply that to beginning doing combat operations. How did you make that transition?
Yeah, so I would say my timing was either perfect or terrible, depending on your perspective. So I got to the
Yeah.
fleet in December of 2000, And at that point, I'd been in the Marine Corps for 3.5 years, from going to officer candidate school all the way through flight school and fleet replacement squadron to learn the CH-53, which was the aircraft I flew. So I walked in the hangar at Miramar for the first time, 3.5 years in, and you're starting over at that point because in a fleet squadron, as the newest boot lieutenant, you're the lowest of
Yep.
the low, and you have to earn it. And I really just did the same thing I'd done at the last couple of stops and put my head down and worked my butt off to make sure I was always prepared for my flights. I was doing
Yep.
the best job I could in my ground job, and really just trying to earn the trust and respect from the other Marines in the squadron, and not just the other pilots, but the enlisted Marines who flew with us and worked downstairs in maintenance. And just really the term we used to use is become a player in the squadron, and that's all I
Yeah.
wanted. I just wanted to turn into someone who was a player in the squadron. And so I really worked my butt off to do that. And then we went on our first deployment that summer of 2001. 9/11 happened during that
Yep.
deployment. We were in Okinawa, Japan. And at that point, I was just getting my first major qualification as an aircraft commander, meaning I could sign for the aircraft. That's like the first big step. But there's another dozen qualifications and flight leadership designations you can attain after that. And to be honest with you, I wanted all of them. That was like my
Yep.
goal, was to get every qualification, to be someone the squadron could really lean on. And so we came home, reset, ended up heading out to Iraq a few months later. But thankfully at that point, I had just enough experience to be, I kind of call it a mid-level guy in the squadron. So I
Yeah.
got a ton of experience in that first, the initial invasion of Iraq. And then it really just snowballed from there. We went back to back two more times after that. But I was just immersed in literally doing the job. And, for better or worse, I was getting to do it in a real environment with real bad guys and all the other things that come with it. So
Yeah.
the learning curve was steep, but it also helped really accelerate how proficient I was able to get in a
Yep.
short period of time.
Yeah, that's one thing. At least from maneuver perspective, like I can quickly get acclimated to what I need to do on the ground and understand that because the basic fundamentals. There's only 7 battle drills, right? And like all my organic and indirect fire systems, I don't have to understand how to use all of those like your aircraft. I just need to know the right tools, the right time to layer the effects to get the desired end states. But like as a pilot, I love through your journey you still didn't master it all yet. Like I think maybe like through your fourth or fifth deployment, I can't remember exactly when, but when you did that absolutely crazy mission to go
Yeah.
get the 160th aircraft,
Yeah.
which I can't wait to talk about. Like that's when you said you were at the top of your game. But like, hey, backwards
hmm
planning off that, that was how long were you in your military journey at that point?
I mean, geez, at that point, I was 14 years into my
Yeah,
career. So I'd been
and
flying
that's when
for
you hit your
over a
peak.
decade, and I knew it. At that point, when I flew that mission, I was like, you just peaked. Like that was it.
Yeah,
Everything you did up to this point was to prepare you to do that one thing. It's probably all downhill from here, but at least you got to that place. And at that
yeah,
point, I'd had every qualification there is to have in the aircraft for a few years at that point. 9 years, I guess technically, but it was just getting there and pulling that off was like,
yep.
okay, yeah, you really got there. I mean, it was indicative of how much work and how much time it takes to really master something.
Yeah, the another thing that we have in common, and just hearing your stories, it kind of helped me reflect on mine. So after your first deployment, you get back, and then you have your first child.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure in my battalion, I was the first person to come back and have a child. It was a competition; no one knew it, but it was.
yeah.
So having that, and then how challenging was it, right, to continue to go deploy as a father, as a husband, and happen to say like goodbye to them? And I can't, and if I get it wrong, I'm sorry, but like Tristan was your,
Tristan,
yeah,
yeah. Yeah, it was extremely challenging. And for me, I would say that's really where I started to become aware of how complex it is to
yeah,
live this life where on the one side you're a war fighter and the other side you're trying to be a good husband and father. And I still think of it as it's like living on two different planets simultaneously.
yeah,
And you have to learn to compartmentalize your emotions and several other things. But it was really tough that first time I left to go on deployment after she was born. And, we had kind of an interesting introduction to parenthood in that, my wife had gotten sick, and Tristan was quite premature, so she was in the NICU
Yeah.
for 9 weeks, and there was a lot of, call it, emotional challenges around that in of itself. And we'd only finally gotten her home for a few months when I got recalled off Christmas leave to go get on the
Mm.
ship and set sail for Iraq. So that first one, deploying after she was born, was the toughest goodbye of all the goodbyes. I mean, it never
Yeah.
gets easy, but I just conditioned myself to be better about it.
Yeah.
But I'll also tell you that deployment was where I decided I'm never going to say bye at the squadron again.
Yep.
I'm just going to get someone to pick me up at home and give me a ride. Like, it was just easier to do it there. And then by the time you get to the squadron, be in character and ready to go.
Yeah, my second deployment, I did that. The first deployment, I did the whole thing, right? Like where the families came out on the parade field, these buses came and picked us up, and then we go straight to the airfield to fly. And man, that was hard. I didn't even have a child yet at that point. Like I couldn't imagine doing that again with like my son and daughter. Like I'm a crybaby as it is, so I don't want to cry in
Yeah.
front of my men, right? So like
Yeah.
that's challenging. And you mentioned something there because I understand that you have to be two different people. Is like, hey,
Yeah.
when you're at home, you're a father, you're a husband, you're Isaac, right?
Yeah.
And but when you're deployed, you're whiskey.
Yeah.
And how did you do that? How did you try to separate those two worlds? Because you
It,
had to
it,
be that person to save lives.
I did. I got very good at compartmentalizing it. I would say I got so good at it that it was challenging for me later in life to try to put
Yeah,
those two things back together and just be quote unquote normal again.
yeah,
But I got very adept at it. I mean, I think I talked about it in the book too. It was when I went to Afghanistan in 2011 for a combat deployment as a major. I was the detachment officer in charge. We had two kids at that point. And I remember I was very aware of everything that was happening. I'd done it, several times before. I understood the stakes, but I just remember thinking, walking out of the house, it's such a bizarre thing to walk out of your own home with your wife and kids and just know and accept and acknowledge, like, I may never see this place or them ever again.
yep,
And by the time I get to the squadron in about 20 minutes, I have to be totally okay with that. And when the Marines look at me, they need to see nothing but, hey, we're super confident and we're ready to go and we're going to go crush this deployment. And I used to call it getting into character. So I had 20 minutes or so to get myself fully into
yeah,
character so that when you walk into the hangar, you are the most confident guy in the room and everyone else
yep,
is going to take their cues off of you, right? It's a lot of
yeah. I
responsibility.
I being like a I took my platoon over my first deployment in the middle of fighting season at Afghanistan, and I had my sergeant major on at the time, my platoon sergeant Derek Kearns, and it's funny like reflecting on that. But you and I shared that same thing is that like, hey, like I call it peacocking, like I'm going everywhere, and I'm
Yeah.
trying to be that guy, unafraid of making decisions, and then being out in the front, putting myself in those more tough situations because like my life is just as equal as anyone else on my team. But it took me a long time. You did it way better than I did, but to separate those two worlds when all the way through my company command time, sometimes my wife would remind me that I was not her soldier. Um,
Yeah.
and that was challenging. Honestly, it was very hard for me to separate those two. So kudos for you to be able to figure that out.
Yeah, it's a catch 22 though, because it was very helpful to me as a Marine, but it was
Yeah.
definitely, it comes with some strings attached, right? So every time I came home from a deployment, it was harder to reconnect. It was hard to be present. It's not
Yeah.
a switch you can flip per se. And once I was there, it was very difficult for me to come back and really reconnect and be present in a normal way. And I wasn't anyone that would come home and be like angry or act crazy or anything like that. It was just really hard for me to totally get there on an emotional level. I mean, I could
Yeah.
talk, I could interact, I could do things, help around the house, all the normal stuff, but
Yeah.
that connection was challenging.
Yeah, I noticed that too. Is that like at a certain point, like things that my here's a like a more vulnerable story is like my grandmother died like when I got back from Iraq, and like the whole family's devastated. She was like a mother to me. And I'm there at the funeral, and I'm sad, right? But like I didn't have the same like visceral emotional response as everyone else did around me because like at that point, like, hey, I'm comfortable with death. Like I knew that like
Yeah.
what I was doing may die. And my wife was like, "Hey, are you okay?" And then I finally got home, and like all the emotions like hit me, but I realized like at that point, like, hey, it, am I crazy, or has something like happened within me? And then I realized like, hey, I'm definitely suppressing some stuff because I think I have to, just based on the nature of my job.
Yeah, of course. It definitely has an effect. And it's a challenging one to unpack later for sure.
Yeah. So, kind of continuing through your book, you had one quote in there that I loved, and it kind of follows that "keep it simple, stupid." If you get excited, you get dead. Could you
Yeah.
walk me through that phrase, man?
Yeah, absolutely. So really where that comes from is we would talk about a lot in aviation that, and it really goes all the way back to Boyd and the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act. And the
Yeah.
Marine Corps teaches that to young lieutenants right out of the gate, with the whole premise being, really just at the end of the day, make a decision.
Yeah.
Don't sit on this, make a decision. But in aviation, that happens at hyperspeed, and you just don't have a
Mm.
lot of time sometimes to really make a decision on what you're going to do. The situation changes. There's tracers in the air, whatever it is. Sometimes you literally only have a second to decide. And so we used to talk about it pretty openly, and we would literally brief it as no fast hands in the cockpit. But what we meant by that was it really was, and I would say if you get excited, you get dead. Meaning, as soon as you let yourself get emotional in that
Yep.
situation, it clouds your thought process, it slows it down, it just delays you making a decision, and definitely delays you making a good decision. So, learning to control your emotions, stay calm, stay cool, is extremely helpful, and I would argue necessary in that environment, just to maintain that. And I'm that way to this day, to a point that it frankly annoys people sometimes. I'll be in
Yeah.
some situation, even to this day at work, and people will get extremely stressed out. And then someone will look at me and be like, what's wrong with you? Like, how come you're not like mad or upset or stressed out? I'm like, well, is that going to help anything? like in order to solve this problem, we're going to have to make some decisions, and to make good decisions, we need to be calm and think through it as quickly as possible, then decide, and then we'll take care of it. Right? We'll figure it out.
I love that kind of framework, and that took me a while. Again, like coming straight out of Ranger School, going and being a rifle platoon leader, like I would get switched on, and once I was switched on, sometimes I did not think through problem sets because I was very
Right.
emotional at that time. But like as I continued to gain some more wisdom and my NCOs I gravitate towards, they kind of pushed me into like that tactical pause space. And that's when I quickly learned. And like even during the firefights, we would have a firefight. Initially, there's something was going to happen. You do a recon by fire just to see, like, all right, are there actually people out there that are trying to like kill us right now? And then in those engagements, I find myself even like slowing down, and it's like almost like a Spider-Man in a way of like, all right, what is in front of me,
Yeah.
and then what are the tools that I have to quickly neutralize that threat? But there's a science to that because you have to think through that problem set quickly, and then you have to act quickly. And I've seen that with like tier one guys and aviators. You both share that. Like, hey, they go enter and clear a room. There's nothing like fancy about that. It's just a basic battle drill. But the speed and frequency of which they do that is world class, second to none. If you're in that room and you have a weapon, you're a bad guy, you're going to die in the next 3 seconds. Like it's going to happen. But they think through all of that because of the repetitions that they go with. And that's a beautiful tool, that OODA loop. I always kind of find myself going back to that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so,
And I always felt like when it's happening, my perception was things were happening in slow motion. And
yeah,
that's when I
same.
knew I was exactly in the right place mentally,
Yeah.
because it felt like you actually had more time than you did. Time slows down a little bit, but it's just because you're seeing and processing everything clearly with no emotional bias that's tilting you in any direction while you're doing that.
Yeah, that's the craziest thing is like thinking about like some of the most stressful times in your life. Time actually slowed down, but it's funny when you reflect
Yeah.
on that.
Yeah,
So, kind
absolutely.
of continuing, uh, you are very good at accepting risk and then managing risk. So,
Yes.
walk me through that mindset. How did you do that?
Honestly, I think that's something that I was just, for the most part, born with, and didn't totally realize it until I was in the Marine Corps. But once I realized it, then a lot of other things started to make sense. And to be totally honest with you, it wasn't until later in my career that I even started to realize it totally. So I'll give you a very short version, but when I was a captain and I did 3 combat deployments to Iraq in a row, essentially 3 in 3 years, and I started to acknowledge just to myself early that I liked it, like it was exciting. I was enjoying it, and I felt like I might be a little bit crazy because I shouldn't be enjoying this.
Yeah.
But as I continued to do deployment number 2, deployment number 3, it became more obvious to me that I really did enjoy it. I was liking it. I was thriving in that environment. And I was still kind of struggling with that. Like, is this normal? Should I be doing this? And by the time I was on that 3rd deployment, a couple of people that I flew with, a couple other Marines pointed out to me like, hey, what's wrong with you? Like, you should have been, nervous back there. Or, I was scared. Why weren't you scared? And I didn't think a whole lot of it. And I was thinking of it still in very conventional terms. Like, well, I have more experience. But then later, a few years later, my major, go to Afghanistan. And I became very aware of it on that deployment. Like, hey, I'm really enjoying this. I would probably stay here forever if they would let me and just keep flying these crazy missions. But I was the logical side of my brain knew, like, that's probably not good. Like, you might need to look into this a little bit. And so then a couple of years later, as I was getting into command, I just started doing my own amateur research into this, like what is risk acceptance, or call it risk addiction.
Yeah.
And I had a flight surgeon, thankfully, who was working for me at the time, great guy. And he was pretty senior as a flight surgeon, which is unusual for a squadron level. But he had a lot of knowledge about this. And he and I had lengthy conversations about it. And I came to understand pretty well at that point that there's just this small subset of people that gravitate towards these professions, and in some cases will thrive in those professions just because they are so comfortable with risk, and not only comfortable with it, they enjoy it. And once I really understood that about myself, it was like so many things made sense that hadn't made sense before. Go all the way back to when I was a kid and would do something that was a little outside the box to get myself hemmed up and in some trouble with my dad. And at the time, he'd be like, why did you do that? And my answer was, I don't know. But once I understood all this, it was like, oh, I know now. Like, that was, even as a kid, your subconscious was just gravitating towards, where's the line and how close can I get to it before I like get in trouble or get burned or whatever it is. And I realized at that point that I'd always had a propensity for that. And it just really came out once I was in a Marine Corps and in an environment where, frankly, you get rewarded for that. And so it's encouraged to a degree, and it really just grew from there.
Yeah, I think it all culminated for you on that one mission of where you had to go support. I think it was in Afghanistan, right?
Yep. Yeah,
So
2011.
the 160th, they wreck one of their, I think it was like a 47 variant,
Yep.
I believe
Yep.
so, and that's similar to what you flew. I'm not familiar with the 53
Yeah.
Echo.
Yeah, so Siege 53 Echo, similar mission profile, assault support aircraft, large, but just a little bit stronger than a Siege 47. So
Okay.
once that aircraft went down, a Siege 47 can't self-recover. I mean, you can't externally lift a 47 with another 47, but a 53 can. So the Army reached out to the Marine Corps for an assist. Mission ended up getting handed to our squadron. At the time, I was the operations officer. I just happened to be not flying that night, and I was on what we called the morning shift, where we'd come in around 10 o'clock at night, fly all night till sunrise. And that's usually when we call them, the named ops and the cool stuff
Yeah.
happened. So we started planning the mission to go do a tactical recovery of aircraft and personnel, and it just really snowballed from there. And we didn't even realize initially that it was a 160th aircraft, but once we did, then I was like, okay, this is a big deal. We
Yeah.
need to get this right if we're going to do it.
That's where I would really love to like deep dive into like everything you've done up to that point. Like we talked about it before, like where you peaked, but you had to understand your system at such a precise level. And then when you were flying it, you even mentioned that you had an epiphany. Like some of your calculations were
Yeah.
wrong, is like your aircraft could actually go above peak performance for a short period of time. Like I
Yeah.
was reading that, I was like, I kudos to you. I don't know how you did that.
Yeah, there's definitely some pilot nerdery in that story, but it was really like, how do we get the absolute max out of our machine, out of our aircraft, in order to execute this mission? And there were several Marines in our squadron. For the most part, most of the squadron that had some hand to play in that, but it really started with a basic math problem. And I ran across to our maintenance control tent. We had this awesome maintenance control chief in there, Jake Lewis. And I just said, "Hey Jake, here's the basics. Do you think you can get 5,000 pounds off of one of our aircraft so I can do this?" And he's like, "Let me take a look." Then like 5 minutes later, he was back in my office and he's like, "Yeah, we can do it. You just have to be comfortable going with no armor, no guns." Like he was just giving me the list of all the stuff he was going to strip off, and I was like, "Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. Like, let's try it." And then we went from there. It was wild.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive. Like just being within PO aviation. I've been around aviation for a little bit, combat arms, understanding some of those sling load missions that we've done, and hearing you operate at such a high level altitude and then be successful. It's funny how good work doesn't go unpunished. That then opened up your organization to support more of the
Yeah, it
SOCOM
did.
side of the house.
It did. So it really snowballed. We were successful on that mission, which was awesome. It was a huge win for the squadron, and I personally definitely peaked that day. But it really did open up the floodgates, because at that point we earned, if you will, a reputation in country as being a viable option.
Yeah.
And the 160th always got more requests than they could fill. So basically, their call it the overflow started coming to us, and so we got to really do a lot of really neat and fun missions throughout the rest of that deployment. It was a wild one, definitely the wildest I ever experienced.
Kind of like thinking through your book that you wrote too. I love how you didn't shy away from the language that you used. In my
Yeah,
opinion, when people write books, they definitely put a filter on things, and I don't feel it's like their true selves. But like when I first chapter in, you're cussing as much as I typically do on a day, and I was like, I love this. So what was
yeah.
that decision for you to kind of like stay true to like who you were and the men that you led when you were writing the book?
Well, deciding to write the book was a very deliberate decision that I made over time. But at the end of the day, what had happened is I had kept a journal the whole time I was in the Marine Corps. So I had,
Mm,
hundreds of pages of the stuff I'd written down over the years, and it was just sitting there on my computer. I transitioned out in 2017, and I was really moving forward, into the next phase of life. But what happened was in 2021, I started really thinking about it, because I kept hearing more and more about guys that were in my peer group that were having different issues, challenges. Everyone's
yeah.
having marriage problems, substance abuse problems. Guys were having a hard time getting jobs, holding jobs, and I knew what was wrong. And so I was trying to just reach out individually to people as a friend, to offer what advice I could, to try to help. But I ultimately came to the conclusion that if I wrote this in a really brutally honest way, just sharing that story might be helpful to people.
I
And
love it.
so when I sat down to do it, I committed to that, to like tell this story in the language of the Marine Corps, is
Yeah.
as brutally accurate as possible, so the language can't be massaged. And I also stayed true to this throughout, in sharing the perspective that I had at the time and place in that story, even if I now know that perspective was wrong. So there's certainly a few points in the book where I'm sharing my perspective on something, and today Isaac is looking at it going like, "Oh my God, you were so screwed up on that one," or "You were way out of the box. You're lucky you didn't get hammered like big time for that." But I just felt like it was important to really share that whole arc, so you could see, how did this person go from being a young motivated lieutenant to this smart ass captain who thinks he knows everything, because he's been to combat a few times, to a major that hates himself because he's a major, to, "Oh damn, I'm the CEO of the squadron now." Like, this is crazy, right? Like, it take you on that whole ride with me, and then end up at the end where you're like, "Okay, all that actually happened. Like, am I crazy? Like, was that real?" And
There,
it was just a wild ride.
there's I think a good question to follow up with that is like, how did you get your nickname Whiskey?
Oh yeah, it's in there. But At the very end of OIF1, we had what's called a beer day on the ship where everyone's supposed to get 2 beers. And it was the day that President Bush had landed on the carrier, declared victory, and all that, right? So it's like we won the war party. Little did we know it was just starting.
Yeah.
But everyone had a couple of beers, and it was not uncommon on the ship for guys to have secret stashes, and those started slowly coming out. I just happened to be one of the fortunate ones. Me and one of my roommates who got caught with our secret stash, which ultimately led to me getting the call sign whiskey, which I never complained about. Like it's uncommon to get a call sign that isn't just like horribly like sounds
Yeah.
terrible and make you sound like a total idiot. So I was like, hey, if the dumbest thing I did in the Marine Corps got me a cool call sign, I'll take it. So it was
Yeah.
whiskey from there forward.
You definitely have a great call sign. Hearing some of my peers, some of the call signs they have, I can't necessarily say on this podcast, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's funny too because it kind of goes back to that level of so you're a West Coast Marine, and
Yep.
then East Coast Marines of like accepting risk, being okay with like living in the moment, making the best decision possible. One of your deployments before you took command, this stuck out to me, is that this was a hodgepodge command of like where
Yeah.
you didn't think you had to go deploy. The leadership's like, hey, Isaac's the right person for this. We need him in there. You had to take Marines from the East Coast and you had to put them with Marines from the West Coast. I know a little bit about this just working with organizations in the past. Is like it's two cultures, same
Yes.
organization, but two different cultures. How did you bring those two together for a successful deployment?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I was very honest about that in the book for that
Yep.
reason because I felt like it's almost like a case study in what happens when you take these two organizations with totally different cultures and try to mash them together. So, needless to say, in the very early stages, it was extremely difficult,
Yeah.
and the way it was set up was they brought the flag, so their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel, was in charge, and he's a great guy. But he was definitely East Coast Marine and East Coast culture. And I was the senior person from the West Coast at the time as a major and was going to be the operations officer for the combined squadron and have just a totally different person, right? Different demeanor, different way of going about things. And just the stereotypes are often based on things that are true.
Yeah.
East Coast Marines just tend to be a little more formal. West Coast Marines are a little more laid back on
Yeah.
some things. But at the end of the day, we're all trying to execute the same thing. We're all proficient in the same things. But there was a lot of head butting right up until we did that big trap mission. And I really think that was the thing that kind of made it all click. Because at that
Hmm.
point, we did something together that was so much bigger than any of us, that then everyone was just almost like overnight okay with each other, and then it worked
Yeah.
from there. But you could call it shared adversity, you could call it a giant success, whatever. But that one big win that we went through, from that point forward, everything worked well.
Yeah. There was another point too that you had in your book that I resonated with is that some of the best soldiers or the best Marines deployed are not necessarily the best soldiers or Marines in a garrison environment because they
Absolutely.
gravitate towards more risky behavior. I'll keep his
Yeah.
name out, but one of the best soldiers I've ever had while deployed, and I loved him. In my eyes, he could do no wrong. But when we would get back, the dude was so talented. He was making catapults, like legitimate catapults, while we were at M4 ranges and M5 ranges. I find this dude in the woods, like, "What are you doing?" It's like, "Oh, I just made this catapult." Like, that's badass. But we need to go do this right now. Could you walk me through your experience there of how you distinguish that?
Yeah, well, it was just an observation that I had. And as I became more senior in the Marine Corps, I was just probably privy to more of it. So I was seeing more of what was happening, once I was a major and above, like with
Yeah.
Marines getting in trouble. And the common thread that I just really started to pick up on was it was our best Marines that were the most prone to getting into some kind of situation on the weekend on Liberty,
Yeah.
you know. And it didn't take me long then it just seemed all of a sudden so obvious, like, well, of course the guys that are the best on the darkest night in Afghanistan are a little more prone to get into a bar fight on Friday night than the other guys. And like,
Yeah.
it's not rocket science, right? And that really ties back into that risk discussion we were having earlier. So those people who are wired that way, me being one of them, sometimes you'll just subconsciously gravitate towards something that's risky, or at least more
Yeah.
so than the average person, and that's not always good. You can get yourself into a scrape here and there. And the Marine Corps, to no fault of its own, really just came a little more formal over time as I was growing up in the Marine Corps. Like, I think when I was a young captain, I'd never even heard the term alcohol related incident. By the time I was a major, I
Yeah.
was hearing it weekly. So there were more rules, more restrictions. We were more concerned, if you will, about being on the up and up and behaving, and not having a reputation for just being these, wild men that were out terrorizing San Diego on the weekends if we weren't deployed. And so there was just more focus on that. And as there became more focus and more rules, and things got more stringent, more Marines were getting in trouble. But it was often our best Marines. But I realized that was the link. And so I actually put that together and gave it as a class to my Marines when I was a commanding
Oh
officer
wow.
of a squadron. Was like, hey, let me put this puzzle together for you so you can see how this happens and why. And I have Marines to this day that reach out every now and then and say, I still remember that class you gave us right when we got to Okinawa so we wouldn't get in trouble. That was awesome. Like, it all made sense after that.
I wish I would have had that advice when I was a young platoon leader and a company commander. I remember when I just commissioned, the guest speaker at Marshall University pulled me aside and said, "Hey, Josh, you're going to be combat arms." And he didn't explain the why, but he's like, "Hey, try not to have downtime. Make sure you're always training and do stuff you'll thank me later." And I was like, at the time, I was like, I want my guys to have downtime, right? Like, I want them to
Hmm.
have that space. And then I quickly learned that they will fill the void with shenanigans. And then you, as the commander, have to deal with those shenanigans. So that's hilarious that
Yeah.
you experienced that like within your journey. So kind of continuing, right?
Hmm.
Get to the tail end of your Marine Corps journey. You get to take over a company. I can't remember the name of the company, but I know the nickname was the Screw Crew.
The
I
screw
think
crew,
that was
yeah,
yeah.
HMH 462. So technical call sign for the squadron is the heavy haulers, but the unofficial nickname was screw crew, which dates back to Vietnam era. On the way home, they got stuck in Okinawa for an extended period of time, and supposedly that's where it came from. But it was a great squadron to have the opportunity to take command of, and that was a really the most rewarding tour I had the entire time I'm in the Marine Corps, which I'm sure most people say about O5 Command, or I hope they say about O5 Command in all branches of the service. But
Yeah.
truly an honor to have an opportunity to work with those Marines in that unit, and it was great.
Yeah. That was I think a fitting into your journey. 7 combat deployments, which is pretty incredible. Like I feel like a baby. I've only done 2. It's luck and timing, right? Like
Yeah.
or bad luck and timing, however you want to see it. But one thing that struck me about your book after I got through the whole thing is you definitely like teased that transition piece out,
Yeah,
and like that's where I kind of want to focus now on.
of course.
Once you made that cognitive decision to get out, what were some of the challenges that you personally faced?
Yeah, transition is challenging, and honestly, we talked about it briefly before the show started, but I ended the book there on purpose because
Yeah.
to me, I feel like I'm still in transition to some degree, even though it's been 8 years. And I don't know that I'll ever not feel like that, but it's definitely been for me, overall, a very good experience, and continues to be a good experience, but also a bit of a journey. And
Mm.
it makes a lot of sense to me why so many people struggle with it because it is so different, And initially, I was just focused on the basics, like, okay, I need to make a certain amount of money as a living to make all this work and take care of the family and do all the things I'm supposed to be doing as a husband and father. And so I've always been a nerd and someone who's willing to put in the work. So that last year I was in the Marine Corps, I was just networking like a maniac and looking at what I wanted to do. And for me personally, there's some fairly predetermined paths I could have taken. There's a very set path for even rotary wing aviators to become airline pilots. Obviously, a very
Oh,
clear path to Department of Defense, related jobs with, pick your DoD related contracting company. But I had enjoyed the leadership aspect of my military career so much in the Marine Corps that that's the thing I felt like I wanted to do in the civilian
mm,
world. And to be honest, I kind of had this huge question to myself was, are the same things I did to be an effective leader in the military, will they work outside the
Mm,
gate with these regular everyday people? And because of that, I gravitated towards wanting to get into the operations lane of business, which is really people and process.
yeah.
And so I looked at that, I started networking that way. And then I came to this conclusion one day, and I tell people this all the time when they reach out to me to talk about transition. One day I realized I was looking for a situation, not a job. And as soon as that happened, everything got easier. And to me, the situation was
Mhm.
operations, preferably director or above, in a small to medium sized company that's trying to grow, preferably that has a lot of issues. And the reason I landed on that was because I felt like in that specific scenario, I would be able to make an immediate impact with the things I just knew, the
Mm,
leadership piece, the people stuff, while learning the business. And that was, it was literally just like a theory that I'd come up with. And I will tell you that everyone I shared that with told me I was crazy and it doesn't work that way and it wasn't going to work. But I've always been someone who's motivated by that exact thing. You know, the same thing had
yeah.
happened to me years earlier when I started telling people I'm going to go in the Marine Corps and be a pilot. They were like, "Yeah, right." You know, so it was. I'd been through this before, but ultimately networked my way into that and ended up landing a first job as a chief operating officer of a small manufacturing company that had plants in 3 states and a lot of challenges. And it honestly, it worked out the way I thought it might. I was able to really make a positive impact on the people out of the gate. You know, I did all the homework I needed to do to learn the business, if you will, as quickly as possible to start making a good positive impact on the balance sheet. And it just all
Yeah.
came together and worked. And so I did that, great learning experience, and then parlayed that into started my own little consulting company with my idea being that I was just going to go around and help a bunch of small companies, do that here in San Diego. And then I hadn't been doing that for very long when I did a project for a local entrepreneur who owns a little chain of retail stores. Ended up, coming back to him with like, "Hey, here's everything I think you should do," and he just flipped it back on me. He was like, "Well, great. Why don't you work here and do it?" And so I've been working for him for several
Surprise.
years now. Yeah, but it's been a great ride. We've taken the company more than twice the size it was when I started. We'll probably double it
Mm,
one more time, but my focus to this day is the same stuff I was doing in the Marine Corps. I've got a team of about 500 people in the organization that roll up to me one way or another. I tell my Marine Corps friends like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "It's kind of like being the OPSO, the XO, and the AMO all rolled into
yeah.
one job." As a chief operating officer, but I really enjoy it, and it's still to me, it's all about the people. So professionally, that piece has been good. I'll also say and share from a very real place that the smartest thing I did though when I was transitioning was as I was starting to do all that the year before I separated, I also started going to counseling. And I
Mm,
did that at the time. I felt like what was fine to me, like, or what I'd know or come to know is fine. Like it was my normal. But I just
yeah.
wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to put myself in a situation where, you know, it all caught up to me, so to speak, a few years later, and then I go off the rails, and everyone's like, "What happened to that guy?" He seemed like he had
Yeah.
it together. It was a very preemptive decision for me, but I continue to do that to this day, just because I'm introspective and I like learning, and I've learned a ton, and that has really helped me a lot, in this next phase of life, and
Mm.
trying to be the best version of myself, not only professionally but personally. It's been good, so I'm thankful that I did that as well.
Yeah, I think leadership is a journey. It always starts with ourselves and then it bleeds into every other aspect of our lives. And I genuinely believe that veterans, regardless of branch, make a bigger impact outside of the uniform than they did in. You make a lot of good connections, but you have those same connections when you get out. You can help them just as much as you could when you get in, but you are making an actual difference and a change in the civilian world. And your book, I think, is a testament to that. So this is a great follow-up question. What's next for you? When's that next book coming out?
That's a great question. I've got a couple of things in the hopper as far as writing another one goes, but I'm still sort of on the ride, for lack of a better way to put it, in this next phase of transition.
Yeah.
So there's a few more things I want to experience before I make a final decision and say go this way and write another one. The basic idea I have is there's a lot of books out there that are specifically about transition and related to employment.
Yeah.
But I like the idea of writing something that's more about transitioning as a human being. How do you go from this place where you're this warfighter guy that functions this one way into being someone who, say, is maybe a little bit more amicable version of yourself that can
Yeah.
interface with everybody on a day-to-day basis in a way that's hopefully positive and making a positive impact on people and in the community.
Mm.
So I'm working through another couple of programs on a personal level that I want to get a little more info on and get a little further down the road. And then I think I'll really start that in earnest.
Yeah, I'm excited to see the journey, man. Like I really and I genuinely mean this. I loved your book
Oh,
because it
thank
helped
you.
me reflect on my journey. Just the way you wrote it, it's authentic. I could tell it came from the heart. It wasn't just about like writing a book to get your name out there. Like you did it from the right place to
Yeah.
help those that you served with, and I always find value in authenticity. So thanks for just taking the time. Um, and putting all your collective thoughts over your I don't know how long you were in, over 20
Yeah,
years.
just over 20 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's tough to fit all of that in a book, but you beautifully executed that. So great job, brother.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
So we're at the final show segment. These are the same four questions that I
Yeah.
ask everyone. I call them the killer bees. So be brief, be brilliant, be present, and then be gone. If you're ready, we'll
Yeah,
jump into
let's
them.
do it. Let's
Yeah,
do
so
it.
the first question is, what do you believe separates a good leader from an extraordinary leader?
I think to expand on something I said earlier, but it's really just learning to be yourself. And the way I
Mm,
articulate this to other leaders is, you know, no offense, but it's not about you ever. It's about the team, and it's about earning their trust and respect. And the way you do that, in my opinion, is three main things. You got to be at least somewhat competent and know what you're doing. You've got to demonstrate that you genuinely care about them, and then you also have to have some level of confidence. No one's going to follow anybody who's not confident. But if you do those things right, and you do those three things well, you can earn that trust and respect, and it won't happen overnight. It takes time, and it really never ends. Like, you have to just keep doing it and be consistent and show up every day and be that person. But if you do that in the right way, it'll really get you back to, go back to high school with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What you're looking at
yeah,
is trying to get to that third level where you're affecting them in a positive way, and that love and belonging level of the hierarchy of needs. Because once you do that and they feel like genuinely cared for and that they belong, you just get a different level of output from people, and the organization does better, the individuals do better. So I think that's the most important thing. Be yourself and approach it in that way, and you and the organization should be successful.
yeah, that's a great answer. Knocked it out of the park. So number two, uh, what is one recommended recommendation for a source that someone can use on their leadership journey that they can use today to be a better leader?
I would say, so as someone who has absolutely learned way more from doing than from
Mm,
reading or studying, I would really kind of go back to, the Malcolm Gladwell Outliers book, practice anything for 10,000 hours to become an
oh,
expert. So I would really say, just get out there and do it. Find a way, whether you have to volunteer or coach a Little League team or whatever, but just be leading, be responsible for people, because literally practicing and doing it every day is the best way to get good at it. There's no one way to lead, or there wouldn't be such a giant
yep,
section of leadership books at every bookstore on the planet. You
yeah,
know, there's
yep,
there's a bajillion opinions on how to go about this. So take the ones that resonate the most with you, and then get out there and practice. And that's something I think that's very valuable. And there's ways for anyone to be able to do that if they just seek those opportunities and take advantage of them.
What was the name of that book? I'm gonna write that down. I haven't read that.
Outliers by Malcolm
Got it.
Gladwell. Yeah. And the whole premise is practice anything for 10,000 hours to become an expert. But then there's a bunch of stories in there. It's interesting.
Yeah, I love that, man. All right, so third question. If you could go back in time and give your younger self a piece of advice, what would it be and why?
I would say I should have been a better follower as a young officer.
Yeah.
My natural tendency was to be a little too much of a contrarian at times, and more often than not, it was coming from a genuine place. It was a good place, and a lot of times I still think I was right, but I didn't always go about that the best way. Sometimes I was probably a little more outspoken than I should have been, and probably a little bit too much of a pain in the butt. But the good part about that, I would say that I learned from is later in my career, I too had company grade officers like that, and I was able
Yeah.
to connect and identify with them, and then later kind of pull them to the side and be like, "Hey, man, I used to be you, but here's kind of what I learned in doing that. Here's a slightly better way to approach it." So I tried to at least learn from that and pay it forward to them in some way.
That's awesome. So the final question, where can our listeners find you and add value to what you're doing right now?
Oh yeah, thank you for that. Well, I'm pretty prevalent on social media. Obviously, I have a website that I put together for the book. That's isaacglee.com. Also, pretty easy to find on Instagram, Isaac G. Lee Writer. Facebook is Isaac G. Lee, and LinkedIn as well. I'm the only Isaac Lee, or I think I'm the only Isaac Lee in San Diego on there, so I'm pretty easy to dig up on LinkedIn. But yeah, please reach out anytime. I always love having conversations with people about whether it's time in the military or leadership or the business world now. I enjoy connecting with people, and anything I can do to help them, I'm generally will try to do as well.
Yeah, I think this has been a great opportunity just to connect. Read through your book. I feel like I knew you before you even came on the show. All that you've done for our country, like in the past, and what you're continuing to do. Just thank you for being what I like to call a purposeful, accountable leader. Just keep crushing it, and I can't wait for that next chapter, next book. I'll read it. We'll do a round two of this.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me on, and thanks for mentioning the book and Hangar 4. It's been a great experience being able to share that.
Yeah, awesome, brother. Have a great day.
Hey, thank you. Take care.